Thank you to the committee for having me. So at the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, we represent migrants across the country, and whether it was people that were in accommodation that we represent or people that were very near to asylum accommodations, these attacks totally devastated and traumatized our communities. I want to give one clear example of someone that was traumatized and tell you, her story. So one example is our client Alia. So she was afraid to leave her asylum accommodation during the riots. She's a former professional volleyball player who fled Iraq in May 2022 when she faced death threats, and she was detained for deportation to Rwanda in 2023. So she's someone who has a lot of trauma already, and she'd come to this country for safety. She's someone who's very vulnerable. She'd made multiple suicide attempts. And after the riots, she told us in her own words, "I'm so scared that this is going to happen to me. I cry every night. The Home Office didn't protect me. They didn't understand my situation. I came here to be safe, not belittled or threatened. It's not too much to ask." She said, "I think English people hate me." If we need any example of what these riots did to our communities, especially migrant communities, this is one. I think the environment that was created by politicians, by social media companies, by the police, the Home Office and the far right enabled these riots, and this is sort of one example of the traumatic impact that this violence had on our communities. The good news is Alia has now been granted refugee status, but on that journey she was re-traumatized on our shores. And I think we really, as this committee, need to take a hard look at why that happened. In terms of the information, I echo what Zara said. I won't go into more detail because we don't have much time, but maybe later on.
Thank you. That's a very powerful testimony. Thank you to all three of the witnesses. I'm now going to ask Alison to pose her question.
You've touched on the role of the social media already, but can you expand on what you think the social media and private messaging platforms, particularly the latter, played in driving the unrest over the summer? It's to all of you, so we'll go along. Kelly.
Thank you very much. And clearly, I'm particularly worried about the way that misinformation was circulated on closed platforms that we didn't have access to. We can easily see what happens on those open platforms, and therefore we're able to at least identify when there's misinformation. When things are spread on closed platforms, combating that and being able to challenge information that isn't true or isn't accurate becomes even more difficult. And along with our partners, we always try to encourage people to take their information from trusted sources, and that just becomes impossible in these situations. So closed systems and closed platforms are something that have been a major concern. I don't believe that the open platforms are easier for us to address, but at least we have more information, and the information we couldn't access was the ones that caused the damage.
I think what's very interesting is the use of WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook groups, discussion forums, closed and open. Obviously X was a huge kind of force in this, where people at all ages, which is really, really important to note. We had youngsters on the street, we had parents, we had families, we had people who had businesses, people who were going to riot and attack mosques. We've travelled to Belfast as well, so and we saw the kind of damage of it. But what we found was people were able to use Islamophobic material, racist materials, xenophobic, all the kind of anti-refugee. They were using slogans and passing that misinformation very quickly through platforms to instigate hate. Some of the colleagues, the Imam in Liverpool, went and asked the rioters, "Why are you doing this?" None of them mentioned Southport, So there was, in some ways, the use of the platform was a kind of propaganda of hate that kind of incited them. This is where we need to go. This is why we're doing it, which shared slogans of hate and bigotry, and particularly referencing anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. That was a strong sentiment. So on these group chats, you would find, they were being circulated amongst Muslims, hateful, derogatory images of Muslims and of mosques that reference, over a period of 10 years, different criminal experiences or whatever. So I think the use of the platform was really, again, coordinating very quickly, but also it was to all audiences and all ages. So that therefore shows it wasn't a very specific audience, but maybe ideologically driven or not, but they were sharing this information very quickly and very widely.
I mean, I think it's, both Kelly and Zara have talked about the instant messaging, and I think I can shine a bit more of light on the social media platforms, because we had a lot of hate during the riots. So I think it's really clear that social media platforms enable the spread of anti-migrant rhetoric, racist sentiments, and it really emboldened those who have been radicalized by years of anti-migrant policies and rhetoric to then take to the streets. So I think it's really important as well for this committee to think about the algorithms which promoted engagement and content with the most impressions. So this led to these algorithms platforming posts which encouraged violence against migrant communities. And this viral content and this viral spread of information really does act like a virus would. So, for example, there are super spreaders. We know what super spreaders are from COVID-19. There are super spreaders such as Tommy Robinson, such as politicians, such as tabloid newspapers, and they use these digital platforms to spread the virus of misinformation. On top of that, like a virus, this information, it then mutates. So it changes, it amplifies, it becomes more dangerous and has more cut through with people as it gets amplified by more and more people. And this creates what we had in the riots, which was extreme information disorder. That's what we saw. And we know that, social media companies and search engines that rely on engagement and impressions to boost their own advertising revenue, they're less likely to moderate this high engagement content. So this ultimately leads to the loudest and the most polarizing views receiving the most digital airtime. So we've seen more and more digital content which targets communities like ours. We've seen this much more on X or Twitter since Elon Musk's takeover, and it's become a really dangerous place for our communities. There's been a massive spike in racist and anti-migrant posts on the platform. But this content generates revenue and engagement for these companies. Right. So they willingly turn a blind eye. And it's clear that this business model that social media has creates the worst environment for people. But I just wanted to say one last thing. Sorry, I know you want to get in.
Yes, I just have one follow-up. Yes. So
one last point is that, in this case, X was the message carrier. And if pigeons, like in the olden days, were the message carrier, would we blame the pigeons? I don't think we would. I don't think we'd be blaming pigeons and having a committee about pigeons. But we need to look at society as a whole. Of course, we need to look at X. But these messages were created offline. They were created in the media. They were created, sadly, by some of our politicians. So we need to really deal with far-right radicalization that is happening online on digital communities as well.
Linked to that, having identified the issue, what should be done to prevent this from happening again, and who should be held responsible for this spread of this information?
I'm only going to give you a few seconds to answer.
If we go along from Ravichan to Zara and then Kelly.
Yeah, well, I think, the platforms must be controlled, as I said. It's really clear that we need to control platforms. We need to really have some strong controls on politicians and the language that they use, which is then used on these platforms, traditional media and other sources of disinformation and hate speech. We've done some studies and research at JCWI, which has found the language that is used by traditional media or politicians is then echoed on digital media and then back again. It's a loop of hate. So it's not one. We have to really deal with hatred wherever it comes up.
Okay.
I think it's multi-pronged. I think obviously there is the social media platforms, there's the level of regulation and accountability, there's political figures, but ultimately it's about empowering the user. And as you said, the hate itself is already there. But how do we empower young people to understand, don't share? So even me sharing it made it worse, right? Because I'm sharing it to my colleagues to say, have you seen this? And then that's boosting the platform, and then everybody's... So I think, and then Sky News or other channels are sharing it. So we are all sharing the content, which is saying to the algorithm, this must be really good content, let's share it more. So I think we've got to look at the user, the young people, the communities we're trying to protect and empower, but also us. We're part of the story. So how are we managing the story? There's only a certain level of regulation you can really go to, and even political speech. But it's that polarization. We're losing the middle ground of dialogue, conversation, debate.
Thank you. I think how we should respond to algorithms when we don't actually know what is in how the algorithm work is a really important question which we'll pursue. Councillor Checker.
Thank you very much. And I think I echo my colleagues' statements around the social media and the algorithm sharing the information facilitated the organisation of the unrest, particularly in our communities. the circulation of misinformation fomented the unrest, but it'd be wrong to think that it actually caused the unrest. And so there needs to be two approaches here. We need to be targeting how this information is shared, and it should be challenged, and there needs to be more opportunity for people to be able to remove factually incorrect information. But also we need to try and understand the causes of the unrest, in our communities, because they are complex, and in our case particularly, they're not recent.
And who do you think should be held responsible for this, held accountable for this misinformation spread?
The social media platforms that are enabling this, without a doubt.
Thank you. Again, it's worth saying in this context that the LinkedIn post, which falsely claimed the alleged attacker was a migrant, was shared more than 2 million times before being taken down. Now, Lauren, did you want to come in very briefly? And then we have Paul and then Steve.
Yeah, no, sure. It was just the question about business models, and I think you touched on it just there about the business models of algorithms, and actually the social media would like people to be looking and watching. And so is this part of promoting the harmful and misleading content, do you think?
Yeah, I think when there's a platform that has a business model which is all about engagement, which boosts their advertising revenue, then no matter what the content is, if it's getting high engagement, it will continue to leave that content on and turn a blind eye until, like the chair said, it got 2 million views before it was taken down, until there is wider action or stronger repercussions for those businesses. And at this moment in time, there aren't strong repercussions for businesses that are promoting this sort of hateful content.
Okay, I'm going to ask Paul to come in now.
Hi Zara, many of my constituents of South Asian heritage in Rochdale felt very, very scared last summer and vulnerable. They were very grateful to the Home Office for swiftly providing security in many mosques. But can I ask you in particular, what's the link between social media hate and violence against Muslims in particular, and how different is it from ordinary Islamophobia, as we call it like that, amongst the mainstream media and maybe newspapers?
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul, for your leadership, particularly at that time. It's the power of the anonymous, You can really hate as much as you like without accountability. And Islamophobia gets lots of clicks, and it's perpetuated at lots of levels. So 40% of all religiously motivated hate crime, that's physical stuff we can see, is against Muslim communities. But online, how do we evidence it? There's so much hate and vitriol I personally get, colleagues get, our parliamentary colleagues get, but no accountability. Politicians fear for their life, but Muslim women in particular fear even more gendered Islamophobia. So for us, it is a wild west in some ways, but also Islamophobia sells. And the worst thing about the riots it really showed is how much people were galvanised on this hatred towards Muslims. And it was perpetuating these bias and stereotypes that already existed, and not in a vacuum. This is a context. You could say it's a post 9/11 year. You could talk about, even before that. But really there is a kind of global phenomenon of this idea that normalization of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. So 2 quick points I wanted to make. There was a lack of narrative of belonging. People couldn't call it, this was Islamophobic hate. They didn't want to call the riots out for what they actually were, but they were coming from us and coming from Muslims. Then there was this kind of the government action, and we really welcome the protective security. Many mosques are where elderly people go, where women go, for after-school classes for kids. They're not fortresses of protection. So when that protection finally came in, great, but it showed the weakness in the system, that nobody even thought Muslims could actually be attacked. And we'd had so much vandalisms and lots of things happening on the back of any bad news story. And so what we really feel is that actually the latent issue of Islamophobia hasn't adequately been addressed. And in these pocket north towns, things were bubbling. And actually, unfortunately, that just came out and spilled out on the street. So I think there's something much bigger we've got to take home. And for British Muslims, unfortunately, the riots have left quite a big scar. And there's a lack of real action and long-term strategy on what are we going to do to tackle Islamophobia and not make us a security issue or an immigration issue, which is what the riots are really pointing at.
Thank you. Eve, would you like to come in?
Thank you. And to Ravichan, it's a similar question, but to do with the migrant community in the UK. So what do you think are the patterns and the impacts between sort of social media, hate speech and violence there, but also looking to protections under the law? Do you think that protections, particularly under the sort of Online Safety Act, do they go far enough? Where is the line between sort of unlawful behaviour, unlawful sort of speech versus sort of harmful as well?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a clear link between years of hate speech towards migrants and migrant communities and the violence we saw towards these same people in the riots in August 2024. And, while organisations like our own have seen this and known this, I think that those riots show clear evidence to all of us how dangerous this hate speech is to all of us and all of our communities. In terms of the question directly and what social media, how that affects people on the ground and how that moves from the digital space to the street space, we've done some recent studies and we found that on Facebook, the mere mention of immigration leads to many comments, many responses, and that can be generally a lot of hateful comments. So, for example, we found that there's a massive amount of mis and disinformation on social media platforms about immigration, and that this is a leading contributor to the hate and intolerance towards migrants. And we've seen that the language of right-wing influencers, as I mentioned earlier, is parroted online and then it's parroted back on the tabloid press. So, for example, some of the comments that we've seen are comments which talk about mass deportations, talking about people that come to our country as illegal invaders, as scroungers, as parasites. So these are some of the comments, just a few of the comments that come up. We've also seen a sharp rise in AI content across social media, and that's a massive worry, and I think something this committee should look at, because that has meant that there's been an ability for people to create false images that spread far and wide and really do convince many people, people of all persuasions on the internet, that the image is correct. So without clearly defining AI content as AI generated and without having clear checks on AI generated content, we're just going to see a proliferation of more of this content. So are
you asking for that content to be made illegal in some sense, or for the phrase such as alien invaders or parasites?
Yeah, well, I think
that is legal speech, would you agree?
I mean, this sort of speech shouldn't be allowed in society generally, I would say. There's a certain level of hate speech that appears online that we wouldn't accept if it appeared on the street. There's a certain amount of discriminatory language, again, that appears online that we wouldn't accept. And I think the way that we deal with that speech online needs to be much firmer. So coming on to the second part of your question about the Online Safety Act, we would say that at the moment, are migrants provided enough safety? The blunt answer is no. They're not providing enough safety online, nor are our communities. Is the Online Safety Act a good move in the right direction? Potentially, yes. But there's a difference between the Act and the enforcement of the Act. So what will Ofcom's role be with the Act? Will they be able to have greater restrictions on social media companies? At the moment, the context is quite worrying. Mark Zuckerberg is moving Facebook away from fact checkers. X has moved away from that. Our own Prime Minister has been attacked by the head of a social media company, and the social media companies in America are very close to the government, as we saw by the presidential inauguration yesterday. So it's a really worrying time. So I think there needs to be clear action from our government and from our politicians urgently.
Could I just follow up very quickly on that before I move on to Kelly? You have quite a nuanced view, I think, rightly, about whether social media is just the newest incarnation of the mass media and previous, and about the interaction with society as well. And so, do you think is it more important to regulate social media kind of content, or is it more important, or as important, to sort of work with communities in the UK around around language generally and around acceptance?
I think we have to do both at the same time. If we're to tackle racism or anti-migrant hatred, we have to both tackle it online and we have to tackle it in the general public via traditional media and any other ways. I think if we close one angle, which is the digital, it will just appear somewhere else. So we have to do it everywhere. yeah.
We need to move on. Steve.
Thank you. And then Kelly, just from a local government perspective, how well do you think you are equipped and local authorities are equipped to sort of deal with, deal with online misinformation, disinformation, given that often you will be at the forefront of dealing with this first and foremost as you see it coming?
Thank you very much, and I echo my colleagues' comments about the concerning nature of this and the challenges that were posed both nationally and locally. Within local government, we have no more powers than any other individual to get content removed from an online platform. So that in itself presents a real challenge, and our ask is that local governments are given more power to enable us to counter, to challenge, to remove misinformation and harmful content when it appears online. I'd also like to see us being able to work with communities. Things like the Online Safety Act are very welcome, but like my colleagues have said, it's the enforcement of all of these things at both a national and a local level that we have those concerns around, and those powers need to be there to enable us to challenge these things promptly, and also to ensure that our communities are engaged and kept up to date with these things, so that these things, because often it is our communities that hear about these things first, they can be a very useful source of information, and we should be welcoming that.
Thank you. We're running late, so just a couple
Thanks,
of
Chair.
minutes.
Yes, a question to all three of you, but let's be brief as possible because of the time constraints. Specifically, were you satisfied with the government's response to social media around the unrest last summer? Maybe we'll start with Kelly this time.
In the government's response to social media was very difficult, and I think they felt the same frustrations that we did. I was very satisfied with the government's response to the unrest and to their support for us as a city. We had excellent support both throughout the entire scenario, but they were in no better position than we were to be able to challenge the social media, and clearly weren't able to act to help us to prevent the violence that we saw in Sunderland on the 2nd of August.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Well, in brief, no. It was, I don't know what the response was, if I'm honest. I think narrative is really important. So obviously there was the justice deterrent, which we saw that had to be done physically, but online it was very hostile, very Islamophobic. The dehumanisation of Muslims was carrying on, and groups were allowed to very, very quickly organise. The police didn't know if it was real or not real, and I think there were so many weaknesses around the chain, and in live time, communities, Muslim communities in particular, are watching and saying, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? So I think there was some really, really big shortcomings, and the government was very unprepared. But also, where is that team that really knows, even in policing, who's responsible for making sure when communities are at risk as they were in live time, able to respond? And most of those police forces were very small. Yeah. And what could they really do? So I think that's something that's a huge area that needs to be tackled.
Thanks, Sarah. Ravichan.
From our perspective and the perspective of our communities, it's really impossible to be satisfied with the government's response to the social media activity which led to the riots in August 2024. The damage both physically and emotionally to our communities was exacerbated by the government's inaction. In fact, the government's response to social media activity which caused the summer 24 riots were utterly woeful, and we would even say it verges on a dereliction of duty to the communities we serve. It felt to many of us and the migrant communities we serve that the government sat by and allowed the violence to intensify day on day. Many were practically begging for support from the government as our safety was put at risk. The statements were slow, and how can it be possible that the riots rumbled on for so many days? So I don't think you need me to say that it was a failure. The evidence speaks for itself. And social media activity that started the fire, which led to the riots, and the large accounts which spread the mis and disinformation were allowed to continue spreading this hate speech and incite violence throughout the far-right riots. So there was no meaningful social media enforcement against this hate speech.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your candour. Given Kelly's point about how the government doesn't have a huge amount of control over what these social media companies can do, but I completely accept the points you make, Zara and Ravichan, about you're not happy with the government's response. What would you have wanted to see on top of what was done?
30 seconds each.
All it needed was counter-narrative. There was no narrative of belonging. There was no narrative to say, this doesn't represent our Britain. There was no narrative to even say Islamophobia.
Thank you.
So I would second that. I think the government could have been much clearer and much louder quite earlier. I would also say that there could be more enforcement and more accountability on social media companies very early, and those hateful platforms and individuals on those on those platforms. The accounts need to be shut down very quickly, and if they were, I think there could have been a much quicker end to the violence and end to the mis and disinformation and hate speech online.
If I might, I would just like to offer a slightly different view. That is that where we saw in the days following the unrest in Sunday, where we saw positive action from police forces that were shared on social media, we had a significant threat of further violence in the days that followed, and particularly there was a specific threat on an asylum seeking processing centre in our city. That did not occur, and I believe that was in part by positive messaging both locally and nationally through social media, and there was at that stage a narrative of, if you do this there will be consequences, which spread well across social media.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of our panel for sharing their experiences of the impact of the spread of misinformation over the summer and the unrest in their communities. It's clear that the impact was significant, that there is people are still traumatized by that impact, that their damage, both in personal and in economic terms, was significant, and there are questions for this committee and for the government with regard to how the misinformation was allowed to spread so quickly. What speedy response there could have been. Councillor Check, I'm very impressed by what you said about the cooperation that with the police and government and local authority, which helped reduce ongoing impact. But I also recognise, Ms Mohammed and Mr Munthi, what you said about the way in which we were all part of spreading those misinformation to some extent, and we also need to address that. But thank you very much for sharing your experience, and order.